Hello everybody and welcome to the latest video in my series on the Tudors for A-level history. We're looking at Henry VIII in this video. We're not looking at the entirety of his reign. We're looking at this second key question: in what ways and how effectively was England governed during this period? And I'm going to break it down. I'm going to look at the first 20 years of Henry's reign. So this is the period before Wolsey, and then essentially what we see is the Wolsey period. I'll then do a second video in which I'll look at Cromwell and the final years of his reign. So government, it's a really big topic for Henry VIII, and there's lots to cover, so I'm going to try and break it down by doing it in two lots. Right, so the situation at the beginning of Henry's reign, 1509 to 1514. So there is some continuity. So we've got the reappointment of people who have been in positions already. So we've got Lovell, who's reappointed as Chancellor of the Exchequer, Fox, who's reappointed as Lord Privy Seal, Archbishop Wareham's reappointed as Lord Chancellor. So there is continuity going back to the reign of Henry VII, continued use of JPs to enforce law and order throughout the country. And Henry kind of reconfirms that he would honour the marriage agreement with Catherine of Aragon, and he marries her fairly rapidly into his reign. But there was also some changes. So we see the arrest of the financial enforcers, Epsom and Dudley, and then their execution in 1510. The much hated council learned in the law is abolished. There's 175 bonds and recognisances which were owed that Henry just wrote off. He also executed the Yorkist Edmund de la Pole, who was Earl of Suffolk, who had been handed over to Henry VII by Philip of Burgundy back in about 1506. Again, there's a little controversy over this in terms of whether Henry VII kind of passed the buck and left orders for his son to execute de la Pole as soon as possible, whilst obviously having failed to have done so himself. And in the reign of Henry, we start to see the Privy Council becoming more important. Now, this is something that fluctuates a bit. So the Privy Council did become more important at the beginning of his reign, but we're going to see two bits that predominate in his reign, where we seem to see power largely concentrated into the hands of a chief advisor, to start off with Wolsey. The Privy Council was normally made up of about 20 men from court. Right, so the key figure in this time frame is Wolsey. So Wolsey is quite a remarkable story. He was a butcher's son from Ipswich, so he's very low born. He graduated from Oxford University aged 15, which again is that point when you sit and look at yourselves and kind of go, what have I been doing with my life? I didn't have a degree from Oxford when I was 15. He goes on to become bursar of his college. He gained patronage under Bishop Fox, and then became the Royal Almoner, which meant that he was in charge of essentially distributions to the poor from the king's household, from the king's kitchens. Now he really rises in terms of station in 1512, where the king is frustrated with a lot of the ministers and men around him who don't share his great desire for glory. I mean, Henry's key desire is to be this warrior king and to gain a kind of glory abroad in battle, and the rest of the nobility are a bit reticent about it all. Wolsey helps him organise the expedition to France. He starts organising in 1512. The expedition happens in 1513, and really Wolsey demonstrates to Henry what a wonderful organiser he is, and this is one of the key bits of their relationship, as well as Wolsey's rise is based on the fact that he can give Henry what he wants. And in exchange for that, Henry lavishes Wolsey with positions and rewards. So he's made Dean of York in 1513, and also Bishop of Tournai in France, which is one of the bits that are conquered by the expedition. He then becomes Archbishop of York in 1514, and at that stage, really, from 1514 onwards, he's running most of the king's business. In 1515, he's made Cardinal, and he's also made Lord Chancellor. In 1518, he becomes Papal Legate, which essentially gives him the power of the Pope within England. So he's raised really high in the church, really high, about almost as high as you can get without being Pope, and he's raised really high within government, about as high as you can get without being king. and he really did dominate the royal council, and is often referred to at the time as the other king. And he seemed to talk about what was going on in government as if it was things that him and Henry were going to do. And then we hear reports from ambassadors and others that sometimes he would slip into, and I am going to do this. So Wolsey's power seems to become pretty unsurmountable. Now, he does carry a whole range of reforms. One of them is in the church. He held a lot of key offices within the church: Bishop of Tournai, Archbishop of York, Cardinal, Papal Legate, Bishop of Durham, Bishop of Winchester, which is a position he's given not long before his death in 29. So he holds an enormous amount of weight. He helped Henry write his book against Luther, Henry, the titled Defender of the Faith, that was given to him by the Pope. He was a promoter of learning. He was setting up a school in Ipswich and Cardinal College in Oxford, neither of which were fully established by the time of his death. He did carry out some reform, and again I will cover that in more detail in another video, in which we'll look at the key question: how far did intellectual and religious ideas change and develop, and with what effects? Which is a nice catchy key question from the spec, and we'll look at that, and we'll run through Wolsey and then into all the stuff that happens with the split with Rome under Cromwell, and then the switching back and forth in the later part of his reign. So we'll do that in a separate video. One of the other interesting things about Wolsey when it comes to the church is it said he had a mistress and a couple of kids, and he lived a very lavish lifestyle. And now bishops often did lead a kind of fairly lavish lifestyle, but maybe not the best example of a member of the clergy, and definitely not maybe the best person to be leading on reform. Right, an area where Wolsey did make some fairly strong strides was in legal reforms. The centrepiece was the strengthening of the Star Chamber. It was increasing its importance from Henry VII's time. Wolsey wanted it to be used to give kind of cheap, impartial justice and attempt to kind of root out old corruption. You get the court of chancery, which made decisions and create kind of precedent, and that was used to streamline the judicial process. And Wolsey kind of lost a lot of the focus on it, and maybe got distracted by things like foreign policy. He encouraged the poor to speak out against nobles, partly because he often didn't get on with a lot of the nobility who he really resented, and they looked down on him and resented his power, and so we do get that bit of clash. And so but the number of the courts cases rose to about 120 a year, and again, this is one of the reasons why Wolsey is championed as the friend of the poor. And the part of that is because he sets up a legal system which gives them access to justice, and this can be seen as being really important and a big change in government at this point in time, and also because he was interested in things like enclosure and saw this as causing big problems. He set up the Court of Requests, and this again was popular because it was cheap and it was quick, and that's really, really important, because if you have to travel distance to a court, if you're a working man, you can't afford to spend days not working, so you need a court that's going to act sharply and quickly. Now, not all the legal reforms remained in place. A lot of them were really dependent on Wolsey himself, so they maybe didn't leave behind a particularly permanent footprint when he went, but elements of it did, and in this we can see Wolsey as a friend of the poor and as a positive reformer. In terms of financial reforms, there's several bits where Wolsey has to undo a bit of craziness from Henry at the beginning. The Act of Resumption of 1515 was aiming to get back the annual income of 25 grand as it had been at the beginning of Henry's reign, but Henry VIII had given away a load of land at the start, kind of going away from the policies of his father. Which is really interesting. This is part of the mind-blowing bit on this, of 1517, where Wolsey issues an order to JPs to buy grain and then sell it on more cheaply in an attempt to try and lower the price of grain. It's really angered the racketeers and profiteers who are making huge money out of this. But obviously, again, this gives us another idea of Wolsey as the friend of the poor. This is helping out the ordinary people of the Tudor world. One of the big failings for Wolsey is the amicable grant of 1525. He tries to essentially bypass Parliament. He's looking for funds for the war with France. The clergy in particular expected to pay tax of a third of their goods, whilst most of the other subjects were expected to spend a sixth. It sparked a rebellion in Suffolk, which was 4,000 strong, and that was by no means the only unrest and rebellion that's caused by the amicable grant. It's a real kind of climb down for Wolsey. He has to abandon it. He loses face, Henry loses face, and therefore, importantly, he loses face in front of Henry, because he's failing to deliver what Henry wants, and that, for a man like Wolsey, is a kind of the be-all and end-all of his career. We see the Eltham Ordinances in 1526, which are financial reforms to the Privy Council. And again, we see the council being reduced, and again, this is part of his removing costs. The removal of the groom of the stool, Sir William Compton. He's replaced by Henry Norris, who was seen at the time as being a bit more compliant, and Wolsey trying to gain a bit more influence. Norris, rather infamously, is going to be one of the men executed for adultery with Anne Boleyn in 1536. And again, so a lot of this can be seen as primarily being financial, because it's about streamlining things, but also in part it is about Wolsey trying to ensure his own political supremacy and his own power. He was incredibly unpopular. I don't know, just to clarify that, he's incredibly unpopular, largely with the nobility, and so he's kind of starting to struggle by the time we get to the mid 1520s in terms of holding on to all that power that he gained 10 years before. In terms of economic policy, one of the difficulties, obviously, when the spec tells us to look at government, but it also tells us to look at kind of social economic policy, is economic policy as such doesn't really exist as a thing as it would do in the modern day, because a government didn't really look to control the economy like a modern government would do. The English economy is largely just agriculture, with a little bit of wool and production, cloth trade, and a little bit of shipbuilding. There's little bits of mining here and there, coal in Newcastle, things like that. But the big economic issue at this point in time is enclosure. I already mentioned Wolsey was concerned about this. He starts a national inquiry into it in 1517, trying to find out how much land has been enclosed, what impact that's having, raise legal cases against people who had enclosed land illegally. But he starts to face opposition from the landowners in Parliament, and then this meant in 1523 he got suspended until 1526. And so Wolsey, actually quite unusually, actually tries to deal with this, what is going to be the big economic issue of the day. There's other stuff going on as well. There's a trade embargo on Spain, and that badly affects the English wool cloth in trade in the second half of the 1520s. Wolsey carries out recoinage. It's this debasement of the coinage where they take some of the precious metals, some of the silver out of it, and then reissue it, and it causes inflation because the monies are not worth as much as it was before, because literally it's not worth as much as it was before because it doesn't have the same value of precious metal in it. But Wolsey needs that precious metal to pay for the wars with France, and he's failed to get all the money he wanted from the amicable grant. Things are made worse by a bad harvest in 1527, and so there is unemployment and there's economic depression, and the poor beginning to really suffer by the second half of the 1520s, and this leads to unrest. So economically, there are some really big problems. So Wolsey and Parliament, well, there isn't a huge amount of this because there are only really two parliaments under Wolsey, one in 1515 and one in 1523. The first one deals with the Hume case. Hume, often seen as being a bit of a heretic, refused to pay the mortuary fee when his child died, and then mysteriously ends up dead himself in the Bishop of London's prison. This causes uproar in London and more widely, and it leads to Wolsey having to kneel before Parliament and ask for forgiveness on behalf of the Church. Something, again, that the enemies of Wolsey are going to really quite enjoy. In 1523, the Parliament's main job is asking for a subsidy. They ask the demand is for 800,000, but only 150,000 of that is collected. So again, maybe not working quite as effectively or efficiently as would be. But the root cause of all of this is Henry wanting his expensive foreign wars, which England really is struggling to pay for, and economically seeing the impact of it. So how much blame we can give to Wolsey, but it does feel like Wolsey largely here is trying to do the king's bidding, but it is the king who is the driving force behind it. So Wolsey and the king's divorce. Well, this is the bit where he gets the big no from Rome. They take the scriptural arguments where they look at Leviticus 20:21, and there's the bit in the Bible which says essentially any man who sleeps with his wife's brother will end up childless. There's a bit of debate whether this includes it if it's your brother's widow, or rather than just his wife whilst he's still alive. It's failed due to Pope Clement refusing to acknowledge that this previous pope would have been wrong. The idea that popes are infallible, they don't make mistakes. So one pope's not going to say that a previous pope was wrong very easily. And we've also got the real complication of Charles V. Who essentially holds the Pope, right, actually quite literally, because of the wars in Italy. There's diplomatic manoeuvres to try and get around this. There's an argument that there was a clerical error, that there's a wording error in the dispensation, but Charles V says he's got a translated copy and it's completely fine. He holds the Pope. Wolsey tries to free the Pope from kind of Charles's control and an alliance with France and pushing them into war in Italy, but Charles V's position is far too strong and they can't do anything about it. There are legal efforts, an attempt to get it all tried in England, in Blackfriars, and so Wolsey can make the decision, which Henry then thinks will go his way. It all doesn't really work. There's very long delays. The Pope says they can do it in England, but Cardinal Campeggio must come over. Cardinal Campeggio suffers with ill health. It takes him forever to get to England. He then wants to do everything kind of by the book and in minute detail, and therefore, and then he falls ill, and everything takes loads and loads and loads of time. Catherine refuses to recognise the commission in the case, and it's all adjourned and sent back to Rome. And in that point, Wolsey has failed. So we really then get to the point where Wolsey is in a very, very precarious position, because whilst there's been all this talk earlier in the reign about how powerful Wolsey is and how he can guide the king wherever he wants to guide the king, and he controls the patronage, and he controls the church, and he's controlling the government, and how all-encompassing Wolsey's power is, really, ultimately, if he can't do one thing, which is please Henry, then we have that real realisation that where all the power actually lies is not with Wolsey at all, but with Henry VIII. And so Wolsey's fall, it's linked with several things. The failure to get the divorce, the annulment of the marriage to Catherine is a major part of it. Henry's not getting the foreign policy successes he wants, and again Wolsey, as his key minister, is going to carry the blame for that. And also there's a lot of people who don't like Wolsey, particularly members of the nobility, who see this moment in his weakness as the position to act and to start turning Henry against him. And again, we might see an argument here that maybe Henry is quite easily manipulated. And he seems particularly easily manipulated by Anne Boleyn, and Anne Boleyn and her father and her brother kind of start to turn Henry against Wolsey. Wolsey is accused of prémunire, which is essentially favouring the Pope in a way that disadvantages the King of England. It's a really kind of old law that goes back many hundreds of years. He loses his powers, his position in government, and is exiled to York. There are exchanges of gifts with the king, and he thinks the friendship is returning. He's summoned to come back to London. He's arrested, and he actually dies on the journey, so he never actually goes through that trial. So if we look at this in terms of an assessment of Wolsey, well, he has a reputation, according to the Venetian ambassador, of being incredibly just. John Guy talks about his impartial justice. He claims that anyone felt they could take their case to the Star Chamber, and therefore we can see in these two interpretations, one from the time, one from a historian, these two interpretations seeing Wolsey as a real actor for good. Then we see this kind of bit about the cynical, the power-hungry Wolsey in his treatment of Seamus Paulet, which is really cruel. You had Wolsey put in the stocks many years earlier, And what Wolsey does is he summons him to appear in front of him, and then keeps him waiting in daily attendance for 5 years, under the threat that if he leaves London and doesn't try and attend Wolsey every day, even though Wolsey keeps on refusing to see him, then he will have all his property confiscated. And again, we see a historian's interpretation. Keith Randall argues that Wolsey prosecution of members of the nobility breached the kind of laws and laws and things at the time, and kind of really gave the idea that he had a desire to get one over those who thought they were his social superiors. Again, a lot of the nobility strongly dislike Wolsey, and a lot of that kind of message is going to come from them. So whilst he can be seen as manipulating the king, he cannot be completely responsible for what's going on. He couldn't hold Henry back in terms of foreign policy completely, though he did at various times, and we'll look at foreign policy in another video. He couldn't completely remove the influence of some of the nobility, Henry's minions, particularly gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, and he couldn't save himself when he displeased Henry. So again, that shows us ultimately where the power lies. Now, Wolsey was undoubtedly a very, very able and very successful for a period of time minister, and he raises himself up from humble beginnings to becoming probably the second most powerful man in England. But there's no comparison when it comes to power with the king himself. And although the king is happy to let Wolsey get on with running the country day to day, there are particular issues which Henry pays particularly close attention to: foreign policy, his own divorce, and on those things that Henry will not be overruled and cannot necessarily be manipulated. Right, so thank you very much for watching. Again, there will be a second part to this where I will look at the second half of Henry's reign, and we go through Cromwell and then the factionalism and things of the later period as Henry's government goes through various changes. And there's an argument about whether there is a revolution in government during the time of Wolsey, at which point it'd be worth looking back on this stuff and see whether some of that revolution had started under Wolsey, which is one of the counter arguments you might see from historians. Right, please remember to like, to comment, and if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to my channel. There's going to be loads of stuff on the Tudors and other units as well. Plenty to keep you interested, and lots of politics stuff as well if you like a bit of politics.